He first realized her betrayal when she slid the divorce papers across the oak table they had once picked out together, a silent admission of 6 months spent with another man. But the end of his marriage was far from the end of his story. Ethan Parker, a quiet grocery store manager who had long put his family before his own aspirations, stumbled upon a fortune that would completely transform his life. While his wife abandoned the stability they had built for the allure of a fantasy, Ethan chose to reinvent himself. Armed with newfound wealth and a sense of purpose, he reconstructed his life, thriving in ways no one, not even she, could have foreseen. And then, one day, he vanished. This astonishing journey was brought to life in the award-winning film that went on to claim the Best Picture title, surpassing others with its exceptional storytelling and cutting-edge CGI. But before we unravel the twists and turns of this remarkable tale, let me know in the comments where you're reading from. If you enjoy captivating stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you're always up to date. That Saturday morning, the kitchen was unusually quiet. The warm Alabama sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains, painting delicate patterns on the oak table where Ethan Parker sat. It was the same table he and Jessica had chosen together over 20 years ago, a sturdy, reliable piece that had been a witness to countless family meals, heartfelt conversations, and even a few heated arguments. But today, the table felt different, more like a wall dividing the two of them than the symbol of togetherness it once was. Jessica sat across from him, her hands clutching a manila envelope. Her manicured nails, painted in a neutral shade, tapped lightly against its edge. Ethan glanced at her, noting how little she had changed in all their years together. Her light brown hair still had its signature shine, styled neatly as though she'd just left the salon. Dressed simply yet elegantly, her outfit complemented her athletic build, a result of her commitment to jogging over the past few years. She seemed composed, exuding calm confidence, but there was a subtle tension in the way her lips pressed together, betraying the storm beneath. For Ethan, the moment felt almost unreal. He had spent countless hours running the local grocery store, built a comfortable life with Jessica, and raised their twin daughters, Hannah and Grace, who were now thriving as students at Columbia University. Their life hadn't been glamorous, but it was steady, secure, or so he had believed. "Ethan," Jessica finally spoke, shattering the silence. Her voice was steady but deliberate, the tone of someone preparing for a hard conversation. She slid the envelope toward him across the table. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low but measured, though an uneasy weight had already settled in his chest. "Divorce papers," she answered matter-of-factly. For a moment, Ethan sat frozen, the words hanging in the air like an unfamiliar language. His eyes moved between her and the envelope, his mind struggling to grasp the meaning of her statement. "Divorce?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. Jessica nodded, her tone softening but still firm. "Yes. I've been thinking about this for a long time. It's not about you, Ethan. You've been a good husband, a great father." His eyes landed on the bold words on the envelope's front, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." His thoughts spiraled through a whirlwind of memories, their first meeting in high school, their modest wedding, sleepless nights rocking their newborn daughters, and all the small, beautiful moments they had shared over the years. None of it aligned with the reality sitting in front of him now. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving between Jessica and the envelope. "I don't get it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why now? After everything we've been through? After all these years?" Jessica let out a long, steady breath, her composed exterior wavering for just a moment. "This isn't about you, Ethan. You've done everything right. But, I've met someone else." Her words hit him like a sledgehammer. His jaw clenched as his hands gripped the edge of the table, his world beginning to crumble under the weight of her confession. "Someone else," Ethan repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief, as if the words themselves were foreign to him. "Yes," Jessica confirmed, holding his gaze with unwavering eyes. "His name's Nathan Grant. He's a real estate developer. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the room around him shrinking as if the very walls had begun to close in. In his mind, images of their shared life flickered like an old slideshow, their house, the family photos that lined the hallway, the quiet evenings spent dreaming of the future. All of it felt like fragile glass now, cracking and falling apart in his hands. "You're leaving me for him?" His voice was low, almost unrecognizable even to himself. Jessica hesitated, her resolve faltering for just a heartbeat. "It's not that simple," she said softly, shifting in her chair. "Nathan's driven. He has this energy about him, this hunger for life. I admire that in him." She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And I need more, Ethan. I need to feel alive again." Ethan shook his head, as if trying to physically dispel the words she had just spoken. "I turned down promotions, for you. For the girls. I stayed in this town because I thought that's what we wanted. What you wanted. Was I wrong?" Jessica exhaled, her eyes shimmering with a strange blend of regret and certainty. "It wasn't a mistake, Ethan. You were perfect. Too perfect." She looked down, as if the weight of her admission was too much to bear. "But sometimes, even perfect isn't enough." The silence that followed felt louder than anything she could have said. Ethan's gaze dropped to the envelope resting between them. Her words pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. Betrayal swirled with confusion, leaving him feeling adrift, powerless against the current pulling him under. When he finally found his voice, it barely broke the quiet. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Jessica replied, her voice gentle but certain. "The papers are simple. You'll keep the house, the cars, everything in our joint accounts. I'm not asking for anything. I just need a fresh start." Ethan looked up, his eyes searching her face for some explanation that might help him piece together how they had reached this point. But Jessica's expression was calm, resolute. Her mind was made up. "Just sign them," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Let's not drag this out." Ethan lingered in the silence, staring at the envelope like it might suddenly catch fire and disappear. The life he had spent decades building, the sacrifices, the love, they all seemed to unravel in the span of one quiet conversation. And yet, as he studied Jessica's face, he saw no anger, no bitterness. Only quiet determination. "I'll sign," he said at last, the words falling from his lips with the weight of surrender. "But I need time." Jessica nodded as she rose from her chair, collecting her things with a measured calm. "Take as long as you need." She left the kitchen without another word, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the envelope in front of him. Sunlight streamed lazily through the curtains, stretching long shadows across the room. For the first time in years, the house felt unbearably empty. His mind drifted back to the day he first saw Jessica, standing beneath the bleachers during a high school football game. She was laughing with her friends, her brown hair catching the bright stadium lights in a way that made her impossible to miss. Back then, Jessica had a magnetic quality, the kind of girl who seemed to draw attention wherever she went, confident, full of life. Ethan, the quiet kid with his nose buried in books about market trends and logistics, never expected her to notice him. But she did. Their first date had been at a small diner just outside their sleepy Alabama town. Jessica had talked endlessly about her dreams of traveling the world, while Ethan, always practical, laid out his plans to build a stable, secure life. They were different, yet somehow, they fit together like two pieces of a puzzle. She brought excitement into his world, and he anchored her with a steadiness she hadn't known she needed. By the time senior year rolled around, they were inseparable. Prom night was a blur of nervous glances and shaky hands as Ethan clumsily suggested they should start planning their future together. Jessica had laughed, brushing off his awkwardness with ease. "Don't overthink it," she told him. "We've got time." But even then, Ethan sensed she had already made up her mind. She was in it for the long haul. Marriage followed a few years later, and soon after came Hannah and Grace, their twin daughters. The chaos of raising two kids while juggling careers had grounded them, solidifying the foundation they thought would last forever. Now, as Ethan sat alone at that same oak table, those memories felt distant, like echoes from another life. Raising the girls became the heart of their life together. Ethan took a job at the local grocery store, and before long, his dedication saw him rise to the role of manager. The hours were demanding, but every evening, he returned to the smell of dinner on the stove and the warmth of Jessica's smile waiting for him at the door. Their modest home, tucked away in a quiet Alabama suburb, became a sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, messy school projects, and the occasional off-key piano lesson that somehow always ended in giggles. As the years passed, their daughters, Hannah and Grace, blossomed into driven young women, eventually packing their bags for Columbia University. Ethan and Jessica had stood side by side, cheering them on, but once the house fell silent, an unspoken tension seemed to settle in the empty spaces the girls left behind. Ethan found himself reflecting more often during those quiet nights. Over the years, he'd turned down several chances to relocate or climb the corporate ladder, offers that could have led to running his own chain of stores. But every time, his answer was the same. It's not worth uprooting the girls, he would tell Jessica, convinced that keeping their family grounded was more important than chasing promotions. His sense of duty ran deep. Ethan wasn't just the father who worked overtime to ensure they had everything they needed, he was the dad who stayed up gluing volcano models for science fairs, who jogged alongside wobbly bike rides until the girls could pedal on their own, and who showed up, rain or shine, to every single parent-teacher conference. Ethan believed his role as a provider and protector was enough, that the love and security he poured into their family would hold them together no matter what. But for Jessica, that same unwavering steadiness sometimes felt suffocating. She admired Ethan's loyalty, respected his work ethic, but as the years slipped by, she couldn't ignore the nagging ache for something more. In the early days, she imagined a life full of adventure, one driven by bold decisions and spontaneity. Instead, they had crafted a life built on careful choices and predictable routines. Jessica never questioned Ethan's love, not for a second. He had been everything a husband was supposed to be. Faithful. Supportive. A steady presence she could count on. Yet, as the girls grew older and their shared purpose shifted, Jessica began to feel like she was standing in the long shadow of his sacrifices. Somewhere along the way, her own dreams had quietly faded into the background. When Hannah and Grace left for college, the distance between them became more obvious. The house, once buzzing with activity, now felt too big and too still. Jessica took up jogging, filling her mornings with long runs through town, as if moving forward physically might ease the restlessness she felt inside. She didn't say it out loud, she wasn't even sure how to explain it, but the life they had built, as comforting as it was, left her longing for something else. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that she had given up pieces of herself along the way. The soft clinking of Jessica's spoon against her coffee cup broke the stillness. Ethan sat across from her, the divorce papers untouched on the table between them. His hands were tightly folded, knuckles pale under the pressure. "The time has come," Ethan said at last, his voice quieter than he intended. "I think you owe me an explanation." Jessica's eyes flickered toward the envelope before settling on his face. "You're right," she said after a pause, the weight of her words filling the space between them. "You deserve to know." Ethan's chest tightened, bracing himself for whatever came next. But nothing could have prepared him for the words that followed. "I've been seeing someone else," she admitted, the confession slicing through the air like a cold wind. For a moment, Ethan's world felt like it tilted off its axis. His heart pounded against his ribs, and he blinked, as if trying to shake off the haze of disbelief clouding his thoughts. "Seeing someone?" he repeated, each syllable heavy with confusion. Jessica's gaze didn't waver. Yes. Ethan inhaled sharply, but the room still felt suffocating. Who? Nathan Grant, she replied with quiet resolve. He's a real estate developer. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. How long? He asked, though he already knew the answer. 6 months, Jessica repeated, clasping her hands in her lap as if to steady herself. It wasn't something I planned, Ethan. I didn't go looking for this, it just happened. A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips as he shook his head. It just happened. That's the best you've got. Jessica winced at the edge in his voice, but she didn't back down. I know how it sounds, she said softly, holding his gaze. But it's the truth. I know it sounds terrible. I'm not proud of it, Jessica said, her voice wavering. But Nathan, he's different. There's this energy about him. This drive. Ethan cut her off, his tone sharper than he intended. Let me guess, he makes you feel alive. Jessica's eyes flickered with guilt, but she nodded. Yes. She hesitated before adding softly, I know it's not fair to you, Ethan. But I can't keep ignoring how I feel. Ethan leaned forward, the frustration bubbling up faster than he could contain it. His voice rose, raw and unfiltered. You can't ignore how you feel. What about me, Jessica? What about everything we built together? Does that mean nothing to you? Her composure cracked, and her voice trembled under the weight of his words. Of course it means something. You've been an incredible husband, Ethan. I mean that. But I've changed. I need more than this. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, leaning back in his chair as if trying to create distance between them. So, what's the plan then? He asked, sarcasm lacing every word. You just ride off into the sunset with this Nathan guy and leave me here with a stack of papers? Jessica straightened, her back stiffening as she met his eyes head-on. Her resolve hardened. I'm moving in with him. He's got a place overlooking the river. She paused, as if searching for the right words, but all that came out was a quiet, it's what I want. Ethan stared at her, really looked at her. The woman he had loved for over 2 decades now felt like a stranger sitting across from him. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing closer as Jessica's words sank deeper into his mind. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to make sense of it all. Do you even hear yourself, Jessica? His voice trembled, caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. You're throwing away 25 years. For what? A man you've known for 6 months. Jessica's expression softened, but she didn't back down. It's not just about Nathan, she said quietly. It's about me, Ethan. I need this. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his chest tightening as the betrayal cut deeper. And what about what I need? He shot back. I gave up promotions. Opportunities. I turned down everything because I thought this was what we wanted. I thought you wanted it too. Was I wrong? For a brief moment, guilt flickered across Jessica's face. She met his gaze with sincerity, her voice soft. No, Ethan. You weren't wrong. You did everything right. And that's the hardest part of this. Ethan's laugh was hollow. Hard for you, he said bitterly. You've had 6 months to process this. 6 months to plan your escape. And now you want me to just accept it. Jessica's posture tightened, but there was sadness in her eyes. I'm not asking you to accept it, she replied, her voice firm but heavy. I'm asking you to let me go. Ethan pushed back his chair abruptly, the sharp scrape of wood against tile cutting through the tense silence. He stood and began pacing, running a hand through his hair, frustration pouring out in muttered words. I can't believe this, he said, more to himself than to her. After all these years, this is how it ends. Jessica rose slowly, folding her arms across her chest, a defensive gesture masking her own discomfort. "It's not easy for me either," she said, her voice cracking under the strain. "I hate that I'm hurting you. But staying in this marriage, pretending, will hurt us both more in the long run." Ethan stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. The tension in the room was suffocating. "You know what hurts the most?" he asked, his voice quieter now but still heavy with pain. "It's not just the affair. It's the fact that you didn't even try. You didn't come to me. You didn't even give me a chance to fix this." Jessica's shoulders sagged. She lowered her gaze, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I didn't know how," she admitted. "And maybe, deep down, I didn't want to." The sincerity in her words hung in the air like a weight neither of them could lift. "I'm sorry, Ethan." Her apology was genuine, but it did little to ease the ache in his chest. Ethan looked at her, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone else, and for the first time, he realized how distant they had become. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Jessica standing alone. The quiet click of the door as it closed behind him felt like the final note in a long, unfinished symphony. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had set. The divorce papers lay in front of him, signed and sealed. The house was eerily silent, but his mind churned with noise, fragments of memories, regrets, and unanswered questions. Yet beneath the storm raging inside him, there was a faint flicker of something else, clarity. The life he had known for 25 years was gone. But now, he faced a choice. He could cling to the ruins of what was lost, or start building something new. The next morning, Ethan rose with the sun. The air felt different, crisp and full of possibility. His first task wasn't grand, it was practical, almost mundane. But it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming his life. Selling Jessica's Subaru was the first item on Ethan's list. She hadn't taken it with her, Nathan's sleek luxury sedan had become her new mode of transport. Ethan drove the car to the same dealership where they'd purchased it together years ago. The price they offered wasn't much, but the money wasn't the point. Watching the dealer slide the check across the counter felt like something else, like a release, a quiet but undeniable signal that the wheels of his new life were starting to turn. Back at home, Ethan faced the overwhelming task of reclaiming the house one room at a time. Jessica's absence echoed loudly in the half-empty closets and the stark, bare bathroom counters. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of what had been, and what wasn't anymore. Ethan approached it like he would any difficult job, slowly, deliberately. He packed Jessica's remaining clothes into bags, her toiletries into boxes, and labeled them all for donation. The easy part was decluttering. The hard part came when he reached the personal things, the framed wedding photos, the anniversary keepsakes, the souvenirs from trips they'd taken. Those were the moments that made him stop, standing still in the middle of the living room, unsure whether to hold on or let go. After what felt like an eternity, he made a quiet decision. The family pictures, the ones with Hannah and Grace, he kept. Everything else, every item that felt like a chapter in a closed book, went into the discard pile. Day by day, the house began to feel less like a shared space and more like his own. With the house beginning to take on this new identity, Ethan made a call to Luke, an old friend who had become a real estate agent. Luke, always brimming with optimism, agreed to help him sell the place as quickly as possible. "Don't worry," Luke assured him during a brief call. "We'll price it right, make it attractive, and get it moving." The thought of leaving the house behind left Ethan feeling hollow, but he knew deep down it was the right thing to do. The next phase of untangling their lives came with finances. Ethan dove into it headfirst. He opened new bank accounts in his name alone, cancelled every shared credit card, and made sure Jessica's name was removed from every bill. Even her phone line, something they'd shared for over 2 decades, was transferred solely to him. One by one, these small steps chipped away at the life they'd built together. But instead of feeling like destruction, each action felt more like laying the groundwork for something new. A few weekends later, Ethan decided to host a yard sale. The house was packed with years of accumulated belongings, many of which no longer held any value to him. He lined the driveway with tables, filling them with furniture, knickknacks, and pieces of a past life ready to be let go. Neighbors trickled in throughout the day, offering sympathy mixed with light-hearted conversation. Some simply browsed, while others stopped to chat. By late afternoon, the tables were nearly empty, and Ethan was left standing in a quieter, lighter house. The yard sale profits weren't life-changing, but they added to his growing accounts, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan started to seriously consider what came next. A vacation, a proper one, seemed overdue. 3 months off somewhere far away, maybe even abroad, sounded like exactly the thing he needed to clear his head. But before he could plan anything for himself, Ethan had one more hurdle to cross. Telling Hannah and Grace. One evening, as the house sat cloaked in silence, Ethan found himself on the couch, staring at his phone. Somehow, signing the divorce papers and boxing up Jessica's things hadn't felt as heavy as this. His daughters were his whole world, and the idea of breaking the news to them left a tight knot in his chest. Finally, after sitting there for what felt like hours, he exhaled deeply and dialed Hannah's number. "Hey, Dad," she answered brightly. "How's everything at home?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced a steady tone. "It's fine, sweetheart. I need to talk to you and Grace about something important." There was a brief pause on the other end. He could almost feel the shift in her energy. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ethan took another breath, steadying himself. "It's about your mom and me," he began gently. "We've decided to separate." Silence stretched between them. Ethan could hear Hannah's soft breathing, the weight of his words sinking in. "Separate?" she asked quietly. "Like, divorce?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice low but calm. "It's mutual. We've both agreed this is the best thing for us." "Does Grace know?" Hannah asked. "Not yet," he admitted. "I was hoping you could help me tell her." "Of course," Hannah said softly. "But Dad, are you okay?" Ethan's heart swelled at her concern, and he smiled faintly. "I will be," he promised. "This doesn't change how much we love you and Grace. Your mom and I, we just grew apart." Later that evening, Grace joined the call, and the conversation followed a similar pattern. Both daughters were surprised, but they accepted the news with grace and understanding. "Are you sure you're all right, Dad?" Grace echoed Hannah's earlier question. "I am," Ethan said, this time with more certainty. "And I couldn't be prouder of you too. That's something that will never change." Before hanging up, Hannah added softly, "If you ever need anything, just call, okay? We're here for you, Dad." Their quiet support was like balm to a wound Ethan hadn't realized ran so deep. As Ethan set the phone down, a quiet determination settled over him. He hadn't just walked away from a marriage, he had stepped into an opportunity to rediscover the man he used to be, maybe even someone better. His daughter's unwavering belief in him lit a fire he hadn't felt in years. The morning air was crisp as he made his way up the rugged trail at Hayes Ridge. The sprawling 2,000-acre forest stretched endlessly ahead, its thick canopy filtering the soft light that peeked through the trees. A GPS dangled from his backpack, and the familiar weight of his metal detector rested comfortably on his shoulder. There was something soothing about the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the leaf-littered path. Geocaching had been his escape for as long as he could remember, a simple pleasure that allowed him to lose himself in the quiet, to chase small victories hidden beneath the earth. Today's target was different, though. It wasn't just a cache box or trinket. Rumor had it one of the oldest survey markers in the area lay deep within the woods, untouched for years. After nearly an hour of weaving through dense underbrush, sidestepping thorn bushes and patches of poison ivy, the steady beep of the metal detector pierced the stillness. Ethan dropped to one knee, brushing away damp leaves and dirt. Bit by bit, the outline of an old brick monument emerged from the forest floor. Embedded at its center was a small bronze plaque, tarnished but legible, the exact marker he'd been searching for. A rare smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He snapped a quick photo, savoring the small triumph. As Ethan packed up, a faint chirp from the detector echoed behind him. Curious, he retraced his steps, waving the sensor slowly over the area. The signal grew louder just a few feet from the marker. Kneeling once again, he dug carefully. His fingers scraped against something solid beneath the dirt. Clearing away the earth, he unearthed a small iron box wrapped tightly in oil-soaked canvas. The box was heavier than he expected, the rusted surface rough beneath his fingertips. His pulse quickened as he turned it over in his hands. It didn't look modern, the craftsmanship hinted at something far older. Decades? Maybe even centuries. Ethan's curiosity burned brighter than his usual caution. Later that evening, the box sat on his kitchen table, its presence almost daring him to open it. Ethan paced the kitchen, debating whether to report it to the land trust. But the pull was too strong. With careful precision, he snapped the rusted lock open with bolt cutters and slowly lifted the lid. Layers of aged cloth lay within, each fold hiding something beneath. As he peeled them back, his breath caught. 12 large cent coins, their copper surfaces gleaming as if untouched by time, nestled against the soft fabric. Ethan stared in disbelief, lifting one of the coins with delicate care. They weren't just ordinary pennies. The craftsmanship was stunning, the edges still crisp, the designs intricate, almost too perfect to believe. He sat there for a long while, turning them over in his palm, his mind racing. He didn't know much about large cents, only faint memories of a book his grandfather once left him. But even without expertise, Ethan could sense their significance. Later that night, driven by curiosity, he pulled the dusty book from the back of his bookshelf, The Mysteries of the Penny. He hadn't cracked it open in years, but now, under the kitchen light, he flipped through the pages carefully. One by one, he compared the drawings and descriptions to the coins laid out before him. Every coin was a large cent, minted between 1793 and 1857. Their size and craftsmanship set them apart from anything found in circulation today. His magnifying glass revealed even more, mint marks, flawless edges, rare designs he had only vaguely heard of. One coin caught his attention above all others, a 1793 chain cent. The first official coin struck by the U.S. Mint. Pristine. Impossibly pristine. Ethan's fingers trembled as he held it closer, barely able to believe what he was seeing. For the next few hours, Ethan disappeared down a rabbit hole of research. Auction records. Collector forums. Articles buried deep in obscure websites. The more he read, the more reality began to sink in. Coins like these weren't just rare, they were worth small fortunes. Some had fetched tens of thousands at auction, others even more. His eyes flicked back to the box. This can't be real, he muttered, running the math over and over in his head. But every search, every photo he cross-referenced, confirmed the truth staring him in the face. He wasn't holding a rusty old box of forgotten coins. He was holding the key to a new beginning. The realization hit him like a jolt of lightning, cutting through the fog that had clouded his life since the divorce. For the first time in months, he felt something besides numbness. Excitement. Anticipation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the coins as if they might disappear. This was more than a find. It was a sign. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the best chapters of his life weren't behind him after all. Ethan didn't waste any time. That evening, he carefully placed the coins into a secure lockbox, tucking them away as though they might vanish if left unattended for too long. His laptop sat open on the kitchen table, tabs filled with articles on rare coin auctions and lists of the most reputable dealers in the country. The quiet grocery store manager, who had spent decades prioritizing his family over his own ambitions, was now stepping cautiously into a world of rare collectibles and high-stakes negotiations. For the first time in years, the horizon felt wide open. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself standing at the base of a towering skyscraper in Manhattan. The glass facade stretched so high it felt like the building might pierce the clouds. Adams and Burns, one of the most respected auction houses in the country, occupied several of the upper floors. As he stepped through the sleek revolving doors, he couldn't help but marvel at how far removed this was from the world he knew. Gone were the familiar aisles of his grocery store and the quiet Alabama suburbs he had spent his life in. This was something entirely different. Clutching a black portfolio filled with high-resolution photos and careful documentation of his coins, Ethan tried to steady his nerves. He didn't belong here, at least that's how it felt, but the excitement coursing through him drowned out the doubt. A sharply dressed receptionist greeted him warmly and escorted him to a private office. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline like a painting, the streets below reduced to tiny veins of traffic. Before long, the door opened, and a tall man with salt and pepper hair strode in, extending his hand. "Mr. Parker, welcome to Adams and Burns," the man said, his handshake firm. "Logan Adams. I understand you've brought us something quite special." "Thank you for meeting with me," Ethan replied as they took their seats. He opened the portfolio, laying out the photographs across the polished glass table. "I've selected 4 coins from my collection. I'd like to put them up for auction." Logan leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he carefully examined each image. The shift in his expression was subtle but telling. Professional interest quickly gave way to genuine admiration. He lingered on the 1793 chain cent, lifting the photo closer to the light. "This," Logan murmured, tapping the edge of the photo, "is remarkable. The condition alone makes it rare, but in this state." He shook his head in disbelief. "Museum quality." Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "I thought so too. That's why I'm here. But there's one condition." Logan's eyes flicked up, curiosity sparking in his gaze. "I'm listening." Ethan slid a single letter across the table. "I'd like Adams and Burns to purchase a parcel of land in Alabama, about 600 acres, and donate it to the local land trust. The sale from these coins should cover the cost." Logan took the letter and read it carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he set it down. "I won't lie, that's not a request we hear every day." "I know," Ethan admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But that land trust is working to preserve something important. This would help secure their efforts for the future. You'd get the tax benefits, and I'd know the land is safe." Logan studied him for a moment, weighing the request. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Parker," Logan said finally, a small grin tugging at his mouth. "But I respect the cause." He nodded. "We'll move forward, on the condition that the coins pass appraisal." "They will," Ethan replied confidently. As they finalized the details, the office door opened once more. Charlotte Langley stepped inside, a commanding presence that seemed to shift the energy in the room. Her hand extended gracefully toward Ethan, her manicured nails glinting beneath the lights. "Mr. Parker," she greeted with a poised smile. "I'm Charlotte Langley, co-owner of Adams and Burns. I couldn't resist meeting the man behind this collection. Logan's been raving about it all morning." Ethan rose, shaking her hand. "The pleasure's mine," he said, feeling an odd sense of ease in her presence. There was something about Charlotte, an effortless confidence that somehow made the room feel less intimidating. "Your collection is remarkable," she added, her eyes flicking to the photos still on the table. "I can't wait to see it in person." Ethan left the meeting feeling lighter, more assured that this new path, while unfamiliar, might be exactly what he needed. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed unexpectedly. Mr. Parker, Charlotte's voice carried easily over the line. I was wondering if you'd have time for coffee before your flight. There's something I'd like to discuss. Curiosity piqued, Ethan agreed. They met at a chic little cafe near Central Park, where Charlotte, wasting no time, got straight to the point. I believe you might be underestimating the significance of your coins, she said, sipping her coffee. Collections like this don't come around often. Have you considered how you'll manage the proceeds? Ethan shrugged. I assumed I'd set up a new account, invest some of it. Something simple. Charlotte set her cup down, shaking her head lightly. With assets of this value, you'll want more than simplicity. An offshore account might be the safest route, keeps things secure and discreet. Ethan frowned slightly. An offshore account? That seems complicated. It's not as complex as you might think, Charlotte assured him, her tone smooth and confident. It's just smart. I can walk you through it, if you're open to the idea. Ethan hesitated, turning the thought over in his head. He'd never considered offshore accounts or high-level asset management. But then again, a month ago, he wasn't standing in a New York auction house negotiating land trusts either. All right, Ethan said slowly, meeting her gaze. I'm interested. Charlotte's smile widened. Good, she said. I think you'll find it's worth your time. I'm headed to the Cayman Islands tomorrow for business. I could arrange for you to join me, Charlotte said casually, as if inviting someone on a weekend drive. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. He opened his mouth to decline, but something about the way she carried herself, the easy confidence, the subtle excitement in her eyes, kept him from saying no. Sure, he found himself replying. Why not? Before he had time to fully process it, he was boarding a first-class flight to the Caymans, seated right next to her. The trip blurred the line between business and pleasure. Charlotte had a knack for making everything feel effortless. Meetings with bankers and legal teams were handled with sharp precision, while dinners by the beach turned into long conversations filled with laughter and stories. Ethan hadn't felt this at ease in years. Charlotte's life was a whirlwind of high-stakes deals and international travel, so different from the steady, predictable rhythm he had lived for decades. Yet, she seemed just as interested in hearing about his daughters, his simple life in Alabama, and even the grocery store he once ran. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood together on the balcony of her oceanfront condo. The warm breeze carried the scent of salt and tropical flowers, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the silence between them. Charlotte rested her hands on the balcony railing and glanced sideways at him. You're different from the people I usually work with, Ethan, she said, her voice soft but certain. Most are all about the next big deal. But you? You're grounded. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Grounded? That's a polite way of saying boring. She turned to face him, her smile warm and sincere. Not boring. Genuine. It's refreshing. He met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. Not as the grocery store manager. Not as the man picking up the pieces of his failed marriage. Just Ethan. And that was enough. Their flight back to New York was quieter, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. By the time they landed, the offshore account had been finalized, and something else, something unspoken, had taken root between them. As Charlotte walked him to his cab, she slipped a key into his hand. For my spare room, she said lightly. In case you ever decide to move to New York. Ethan watched her walk away, the faint glow of city lights reflecting off her hair as she disappeared into the crowd. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, the key cold in his palm, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an empty void. It felt like a canvas. One waiting for him to pick up the brush. Back in Alabama, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he reviewed the final transaction documents from Adams and Burns. The sale of the 4 coins had gone smoothly, and now, sitting safely in his offshore account, was a sum of money he never thought he'd see in his lifetime. The kind of wealth that could change everything. For years, Ethan's life had revolved around tight budgets, cautious spending, and careful planning. Now, for the first time, he wasn't worrying about bills or saving for emergencies. He had options. Freedom. But more than that, he had something else, a spark of ambition. The discovery and sale of the coins had reignited something within him, a hunger to learn, to build, to see just how far this new chapter could go. Ethan found himself drawn deeper into the world of coin collecting, spending late nights scrolling through online forums, researching rare finds, and connecting with seasoned collectors. What started as a curiosity quickly became a passion. His confidence grew alongside his financial stability. He sold his house in Alabama with Luke's help, sealing the deal with ease. Every step felt less like leaving something behind and more like moving towards something bigger. As the move to New York came into focus, Ethan began to reinvent himself in subtle but meaningful ways. He swapped out his worn flannels for crisp, tailored shirts. The scuffed boots he had worn for years were replaced by polished shoes that felt foreign at first but soon became part of his new reflection. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors stopped him during errands, offering compliments that felt genuine but distant. "You seem different, Ethan," one remarked at a yard sale. "More sure of yourself." Ethan simply smiled, knowing the change wasn't for anyone else. It was for him. Charlotte's presence lingered in his thoughts, her influence weaving through his decisions. She had opened a door he hadn't known existed, and with every passing day, Ethan felt more prepared to walk through it. His old life, the grocery store, the routines, the quiet sacrifices, felt like a story he had closed the book on. Now, he stood at the edge of something new, staring at that blank canvas. And for the first time in years, he was ready to start painting. Though their time together had been brief, Charlotte's unapologetic approach to life had shifted something in Ethan. Her confidence wasn't flashy, it was quiet but unwavering, the kind that made you question why you'd ever accepted less than you deserved. She never pushed him outright, but her words lingered long after their conversations ended. "Why settle for what's comfortable when you're capable of so much more?" she had asked over dinner one evening in New York. That question nestled itself in his mind, surfacing each time doubt crept in. It nudged him when he hesitated, reminding him that playing it safe had only ever taken him so far. Ethan found himself adopting pieces of Charlotte's mindset, not the polished sophistication or high-end lifestyle, but the belief that he was allowed to want more. He began setting real goals for the first time in years. He wanted to dive deeper into coin collecting, to take risks, to explore the parts of himself he had shelved while devoting his life to family and routine. During one late-night call, when he mentioned second-guessing his decision to move, Charlotte's response cut through his hesitation. "You're more resourceful than you realize, Ethan," she said plainly. "Don't let anyone, especially yourself, convince you otherwise." Those words stayed with him. By the time Ethan finalized his plans to move to New York, he wasn't just following a whim. It felt like a path he'd chosen deliberately, step by step. Charlotte had offered her spare room as a landing spot, and while the thought of uprooting his life still felt surreal, it didn't feel reckless. It felt necessary. Packing the last of his belongings, Ethan caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. There was something new in the way he stood, shoulders straighter, gaze steadier. A quiet confidence, the kind that came from finally trusting himself. This wasn't about wealth or ambition. It was about reclaiming the parts of him that had gone dormant. He smiled, realizing he was finally stepping into the man he had always been meant to be. The cracks in Nathan Grant's carefully crafted empire began to show just a few months after Jessica moved in. Riverfront development, once the golden child of real estate circles, was now sinking under the weight of delays, lawsuits, and mounting debt. The sleek condo by the river, the luxury BMW, the lavish dinners, they were all built on unstable ground. Loans stretched thin. Projects stalled. At first, Jessica didn't notice. Nathan's charm hadn't worn off yet, and he brushed aside any concerns with that easy smile. "It's just a cash flow thing," he'd say, dropping a kiss on her cheek as if that was enough to dissolve the growing unease. But the cracks widened. Contractors stopped returning calls. Creditors circled like vultures. Whispers of insolvency trickled into their once glamorous social circles. Jessica tried to ignore it, but doubt clung to her. When the lawsuits started rolling in, there was no brushing it aside. Nathan's assets were frozen, his carefully constructed facade crumbling brick by brick. One morning, Jessica woke to find his side of the closet empty. A note, hastily scrawled and left on the counter, was the only trace of him. "I need to step away for a bit. Don't worry, I'll figure this out." But Nathan never came back. The weight of reality hit Jessica with brutal force. She was alone in a city where she barely knew anyone, left behind in an apartment under Nathan's name. Within weeks it was repossessed. Her parents, sympathetic but stretched thin, could offer little beyond tired reassurances. Her pride kept her from calling Hannah or Grace. Her daughters had warned her about Nathan from the beginning, and she couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in their voices. For the first time in years, Jessica felt stripped bare. The life she envisioned when she left Ethan seemed like a cruel joke now. The stability she had once resented had been a shield she hadn't known she needed. And now it was gone. It was a humid afternoon when Jessica appeared on Ethan's doorstep, unannounced. Ethan had just finished sealing the last box for his move to New York when he opened the door to find her standing there, clutching her purse with both hands like it might anchor her. She looked unsure of herself, something he wasn't used to seeing. "Jessica," he said, his tone even but cautious. "Hi," she replied softly, offering a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. The house was half empty, stripped down in preparation for his departure. Jessica's eyes flicked around the room, lingering on the missing furniture and stacked boxes. "You're leaving," she said quietly, more observation than question. "I am," Ethan replied, leaning against the edge of the kitchen counter. "New York. Tomorrow morning." Jessica nodded, chewing the inside of her cheek. Silence hung between them, weighted and full of things left unsaid. "I guess I should have called," she murmured, finally meeting his gaze. "It's fine," Ethan replied, though he wasn't entirely sure it was. "What brings you here, Jess?" Her shoulders sagged. "Nathan's gone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's gone." Ethan studied her carefully, waiting for the wave of resentment that he expected to rise. But it didn't come. Instead, all he felt was tired. "I'm sorry," he said, and to his surprise, he meant it. Jessica's eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked the tears away. "I guess I thought I knew what I wanted," she said softly. "Turns out, I didn't." Ethan sighed, crossing his arms. "Yeah," he said. "I know the feeling." For the first time in years, they stood face to face, not as husband and wife, not as adversaries, but as two people who had lost parts of themselves along the way. And maybe, just maybe, they could find pieces of who they used to be. "This is a surprise. Can I come in?" Jessica's voice was soft, almost uncertain. Ethan hesitated for just a breath before stepping aside. "Yeah, sure." The house felt different, even to him. The bare walls, the neatly stacked boxes, everything pointed to the fact that this chapter of his life was coming to a close. Jessica stepped inside, her eyes flicking around the room, pausing on the empty spaces where furniture once stood. "You're really leaving," she murmured. "I am," Ethan replied simply. "New York." Jessica nodded, fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I heard about the coins. You've done well for yourself." Ethan arched an eyebrow. Why are you here, Jess? She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the floor. The confidence that once defined her was nowhere to be found. I need help, Ethan. There it was, the vulnerability he'd never expected to hear from her. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe. Help with what? Jessica's voice dropped, her words fragile. Nathan's gone. He left me with nothing. I don't know what to do. Ethan studied her carefully, searching for traces of the woman he had once shared his life with. What he saw instead was someone worn down by choices that had led her far from the life they once built. I'm sorry to hear that, he said after a long pause, his tone polite but distant. Jessica looked up, searching his face for something, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. That's it? She asked, the faintest tremble in her voice. After everything, you're just going to send me away? Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening across his chest. Jessica, I spent years putting your needs ahead of my own. I turned down promotions, stayed in this town, and made sacrifices because I thought we were working toward the same future. But you made it clear that wasn't enough. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I know. I made a mistake, Ethan. I see that now. It's not about mistakes, he replied, his voice even. It's about moving forward. I've finally found something that feels right, and I can't go backward. Jessica seemed ready to argue, to reach for something that might change his mind. But the fight drained out of her before she could speak. Instead, she gave him a small nod. I understand, she whispered. As she turned to leave, Ethan felt the familiar tug of guilt pulling at him. But this time, he didn't let it take hold. He watched her disappear down the front steps, knowing in his heart that he had made the right call. For too long, he had lived his life trying to meet everyone else's needs. This time, he was choosing himself. The days leading up to Ethan's move passed in a blur. Luke handled the house sale seamlessly, finalizing everything with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The new owners were eager to settle in, and the proceeds from the sale were safely tucked away in Ethan's account. Ethan spent his time dismantling the remnants of his old life, sorting through rooms that had been filled with memories. There was something cleansing about the process, like shedding a skin that no longer fit. As he packed, he came across a weathered photo album buried at the bottom of a drawer. Flipping it open, he found page after page of Hannah and Grace at every stage of their lives, birthday parties, family vacations, moments he hadn't thought about in years. A smile tugged at his lips. There was no ache, no sense of regret. He had given them everything he could, and they had grown into remarkable women. Now, it was his turn to start fresh. The weekend before his departure, Hannah and Grace showed up unexpectedly, arms full of takeout and enough energy to fill the empty house. Dad, this is incredible, Hannah said, surveying the stacks of labeled boxes. You're really doing it. I am, Ethan replied, his smile soft but sure. Grace wrapped her arms around him, holding on just a little longer than usual. We're proud of you, she said quietly. I know this wasn't easy. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't, he admitted. But it feels right. They spent the day tying up loose ends, sorting the last of the items to be donated, sharing stories, and making their way through familiar corners of the house. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them sat together on the porch steps, the golden glow of sunset stretching across the front yard. This place holds a lot of memories, Hannah said, her gaze drifting across the neighborhood. It does, Ethan agreed. But memories aren't tied to a house. We take them with us. Grace leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. Wherever you end up, you know we'll visit. New York's not that far. Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her. I'm counting on it. And as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time. You've shown us what it means to keep moving forward, Hannah said, her voice unusually serious. That's a lesson we won't forget. Ethan smiled softly, his chest tightening with quiet pride. Knowing his daughters saw him as resilient, someone they could look up to, meant more than any amount of money ever could. Later that evening, as Ethan sat among the last few boxes, his phone buzzed. Charlotte's name lit up the screen. "Ethan," she greeted, her voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and certainty. "Are you ready for the big move?" "Almost," he replied, glancing around at the half-empty room. "Just tying up a few loose ends." "Good," she said lightly. "I've arranged for the movers to deliver your things to my place. The spare room's ready. Make yourself at home." Ethan chuckled. "You make it sound so easy." "It is easy," Charlotte replied, a hint of playfulness dancing in her tone. "You're starting over, with a front row seat to the greatest city in the world. What's not to love?" Her confidence was contagious. Ethan had been hesitant at first, sharing space with Charlotte felt like stepping too quickly into something new. But now, he found himself looking forward to it. Her invitation wasn't just about convenience. It was an acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. By the time the movers hauled the last box into the truck, Ethan stood on the front lawn of his Alabama home, hands in his pockets. The house felt different now, stripped of furniture and memories, just an empty shell echoing with the weight of the past. He took a deep breath, letting the warm air settle around him. The years spent in this house, the holidays, the milestones, even the arguments, felt like chapters in a book that had finally reached its conclusion. Ethan wasn't just leaving behind four walls. He was leaving behind the man he used to be. The plane touched down at LaGuardia, and as Ethan stepped through the bustling terminal, Charlotte was already waiting for him, leaning casually against a pillar with that ever-present air of confidence. "Welcome to New York," she said with a smile. Ethan felt something shift within him, a sense of anticipation, of stepping into something new. As they walked out into the hum of Manhattan streets, the city's energy wrapped around him. The possibilities stretched out endlessly, reflecting in the glass towers and crowded sidewalks. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ethan stood on the balcony of Charlotte's apartment, a glass of wine in hand, the city sprawled beneath him like a living, breathing canvas. The lights flickered like stars, and the low hum of distant traffic filled the air. New York felt alive in a way that Alabama never had. It pulsed with ambition, with reinvention. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he belonged here. He sipped his wine, reflecting on the past few months, how quickly everything had shifted. There was a time when the weight of Jessica's betrayal felt impossible to bear. The sting of being left behind, the sense of failure, but now, it felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else. That pain had been a catalyst, pushing him to confront the parts of himself he had long neglected. Ethan had spent so many years defining his worth by his ability to provide for others, sacrificing, compromising, settling. But now he was learning to invest in himself. The treasure he'd unearthed had given him more than just wealth. It had forced him to step outside of the life he thought he needed, to realize he was capable of more than just getting by. His days in New York were filled with possibilities. Mornings were spent researching coin markets and attending auctions, a hobby that had unexpectedly transformed into something far more fulfilling. Afternoons drifted by in museums and parks, the city's endless corners offering new places to explore. And in the evenings, Charlotte often found him in the kitchen, pouring wine as they shared stories over dinner. There was something easy about their time together, effortless conversations that stretched long into the night, laughter that came without hesitation. Charlotte was unlike anyone he had known. She challenged him, encouraged him, but never tried to change him. Ethan found himself wondering, more often than not, what exactly this was between them. But he wasn't in a rush to define it. For now, it was enough to enjoy the moments as they came, to let the future unfold one step at a time. As he gazed out at the shimmering skyline, Ethan smiled. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Each day felt like another step forward, toward the man Ethan was becoming. A man shaped not by the weight of his past but by the possibilities that lay ahead. His transformation wasn't just a product of circumstance or luck. It was the result of peeling back the layers that had settled over him during years of routine, compromise, and quietly fading dreams. The painful chapter he left behind in Alabama wasn't something he carried anymore. Instead, it stood as the foundation on which he was rebuilding, one brick at a time. As the weeks in New York passed, Ethan found himself settling into this new life with a sense of ease he hadn't expected. His bond with Charlotte had grown naturally, deepening in ways that felt both inevitable and unforced. What began as a professional connection, built on shared ambition and mutual respect, had blossomed into something that neither of them felt the need to label. Charlotte's sharp intellect and fearless approach to life challenged Ethan, pushing him in ways he hadn't been pushed in years. In return, his steady presence seemed to ground her, offering a quiet calm to the whirlwind that often surrounded her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and the city lights flickered to life, they sat together on her balcony. The air carried the faint hum of New York beneath them, a city that never truly went quiet. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. She studied Ethan for a long moment, then asked with a curious smile, "Do you ever think about what's next?" Ethan chuckled, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the railing. "Every day," he admitted. "But for once, I'm not in a hurry to figure it all out. I'm just enjoying the ride." Her smile softened as she watched him, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good," she said. "You deserve that." There was something unspoken in the space between them, a shared understanding that neither needed to rush whatever this was becoming. And while Ethan was cautious about the idea of stepping into a new relationship, he couldn't deny the growing connection. Charlotte wasn't just someone he admired. She was someone who saw him, truly saw him, not for his past mistakes, but for the man he was now. In many ways, she had helped him see that man, too.